Look, I'm going to jump right in, man. I'm sorry. Where I sit, this really does look like not even a creeping coup. I don't understand how Elon Musk and his people, and I'll get to immigration, I'll get to everything else, closing AID, the freeze, et cetera. But Gary, tell me how I'm supposed to digest Elon Musk and his people going into the Treasury, locking out employees who have access, legitimate government employees, to their computers. They are locked out, and now he and his people, most of them are between like 18 and 25 years old. They are, I mention that only because, they're not like people who have, decades in government, and they are downloading information. Much of it, I mean, maybe all of it, is personal to taxpayers and to companies and businesses. Speak to me how I'm supposed to digest this, please.
Well, first off, yeah, you better be ready on the weekends, Mark, because it's obvious that this is a 24/7 operation we got going on right now in Washington. And just to step back from the politics of it a second, you just have to say Washington is at least doing something. All right. Many people hate what's happening, but there is, to use the word unprecedented does not obviously cover it. But for guys like me, of course, and guys like you, there is no weekends off right now. I mean, you had better be on top of your game, come Monday morning at 6 a.m., knowing all the things that happen, including at 11:30 on a Saturday night. So there we are. Now, as far as Doge, what's interesting to me is that Doge is beginning to be clearly one of the things that keeps rising to the surface, right? I mean, it's across various agencies, across various, interest group capacities. And so I don't know how long this run for Elon's going to go on, but it is remarkable how much the Doge cloud, you could say, is hovering over many aspects of the government. Now, the Trump people would defend him, say, he told you, right? He told you there was going to be this kind of a thing. And I think a lot of people, of course, in Washington said, yeah, right. Everybody says stuff during the campaign, but now it's happening. So it's sort of like, Mark, and part of the challenge, you asked for specifics. Part of the challenge, Mark, is that as we're now beginning to see unfold in the last 2 weeks, there's a lot of trial balloons that get floated, so to speak. I mean, look what happened this morning with Mexico and the tariffs, right? I mean, I had a feeling, as did a number of people in Washington. Okay, the Saturday massacre with the tariffs in China and Canada and Mexico. Well, let's see what happens comes Monday. And of course, now they're put on hold for a month, and that is the Mexican tariffs, because supposedly the Mexican president, and she's announced this as well, is going to put 10,000 troops on the border to try to help deal with fentanyl and immigration. So how much of this stuff is window dressing and leverage, and how much of it's going to actually play out in a concrete fashion, that is really yet to be determined.
I'm glad you mentioned window dressing, because the whole thing struck me as theater. Trump does theater really well. He does the announcement really well. He does the bullying really well. Now he has America behind him, meaning the government. He's got the biggest military in the world. There's a lot of bullying he can now do, strongest economy in the world, et cetera. And so he's doing it. But it struck me that just what you sort of hinted at is the response from the Mexican government, which is placate this guy somehow, give him something. Great, 10,000 troops to the border. I mean, I don't think, I say I suspect we know equally that may or may not make a difference. I'm guessing it won't. I think it just addresses sort of the overall articulated concern that Trump had in talking about Mexico. But with Canada, I don't understand what his problem with Canada is. He mentions fentanyl and he mentions illegal immigration. I mean, even Lindsey Graham, who was on this weekend talking about, Lindsey Graham is just an utter supplicant, and he just is serving up whatever Trump's latest policy is. So his latest policy with Mexico and Canada, Graham was talking about Mexico and all of the illegal flow of drugs and people. He didn't mention Canada because there's nothing to mention. I'm asking you, what's the end game here for Trump? I don't see how he gains political points by taking on Canada.
Well, Canada's a whole different ballgame, and the politics are very different than Mexico. I personally feel like he is more than ready to have, shall we call it, an ally north of the border rather than what he perceives to be an adversary or somebody on the other side of the political spectrum. And I think he'd be more than happy to see Trudeau go. And I think that's part of this. But, they too are supposed to have a follow-up phone call. They had one early this morning, apparently. There's supposed to be one later today to try to avoid, I guess at midnight tonight is when these things are supposed to kick in for Canada. Now, what leverage does he want? Is it fentanyl and illegal immigration, or is it other things? I mean, Trump has said that he didn't feel like, for example, we had, in his view, appropriate, easy access to some of the energy reserves that could help in the U.S. There's a lot of concerns for Canada and Mexico, by the way, in terms of autos and auto part production, because many Americans don't know this, but almost every automobile sold in the United States has at least part of it constructed or manufactured in one of those two countries. Okay, Canada or Mexico.
Now,
so, Mark,
they go back and forth across the border 6 or 7 times often. Yeah.
Yeah, I suspect that there are a number of different items on the Trump wish list other than just fentanyl and illegal immigration. To your point, there's a lot of trading reciprocity that he doesn't feel like, as you know, he's said this for years, that we're getting the short end of the stick, even with our closest trading partners, Canada and Mexico. And, so he's putting the pedal to the metal. We're going to see where this goes. Trudeau is fighting for his political life, as you know. He is saying, we got to go Canada first and all of this. We'll see where this ends up. I think the next 24 hours are going to be very interesting as it relates to Canada.
I mean, when you talk about Trudeau, it sounds to me like, you really have tipped the hand, which is he doesn't like Trudeau because his loyalties aren't what other world leaders might express to Donald Trump, like an Orban type thing. I mean, that really must be what it's about, because the economics of it just don't track. I mean, even what you were saying, okay, so you're not getting enough in the way of oil, something, technologies. So you're going to put a tariff on Canadian oil? I mean, if you're not getting enough oil relief from Canada, that's not the way to get more. I mean, it's an odd thing. And in the Wall Street Journal, and the Wall Street Journal is a right-wing op-ed piece churning machine. Tariffs are taxes, they say. And when you tax something, you get less of it. Who pays the tariff depends on the elasticity of supply and demand for the specific goods, but Mr. Trump wants American workers and employers to take one for the team. This is the Wall Street Journal writing this. Hope you don't lose your job or business before the golden age arrives. That's what he was promising, a golden age, in one of his proclamations of Trump. The economic fallout began Saturday evening as Canada said it will retaliate with a 25% tariff on $30 billion of U.S. goods, with another $125 billion to follow in 3 weeks. And then we know about the Mexico thing, because they so Canada's new border taxes will hit orange juice, whiskey, and peanut butter, all from states with GOP senators. You remember, Gary, they did that once before. Remember in the first Trump term where they targeted Harley Davidson and they targeted a couple other. So you begin this thing. China's also involved with this. And it was only because Mexico made their deal that the stock market bounced back a little bit today. Don't you think, and isn't it fairly conventional thinking, that a trade war like this, like starting a trade war for apparently no reason, is likely to be bad for the economy?
Yeah, I think there's widespread unanimity on this, Mark, that a long-term sustained trade war is not a good thing. I don't think there's any question about that. And again, coming back to some of the specifics on this, interestingly, you talked about him tipping the hand on the oil thing. He said, well, on the Canadian oil is only going to get a 10% tariff. So there was a good indication right there of a recognition, okay, that's probably the one he's most concerned about in terms of it's inflationary or, feel it immediately at the pump for Americans. So, the China thing is far more long-term, and there's no doubt that this is just the opening salvo and how Trump's going to deal with China. But I really, my gut tells me, especially what we've seen with Mexico today, I will be very surprised if Trudeau follows through on those numbers you talked about, because remember, Canadians would be experiencing the same thing. Do moms want their peanut butter prices going up by 25%? whoever's drinking whiskey in Canada want you, right? I mean, so in other words, it's reciprocal, the pain. Does that make sense? That's why economists will say trade wars aren't good for anybody, because everybody feels the pain, right? I mean, Trump has tried to say long term it's going to fill our U.S. government coffers. There's, of course, an irony with that because, conservatives don't want to have a lot of money coming into the government. And then you say we're going to fill the government coffers at that. But his thing is, well, we're going to pay for other things that we want to, do more of, like defense and all. Well, we'll see how it plays out.
Well, we know what he really wants to pay for, and it's the same thing Musk wants to pay for, is a tax cut. That's what's coming,
Right.
and they're looking to offset the cost of that. The last thing I'll say on this, because then I want to double back to Musk and his role, is that even if we can take it, I mean, I understand that the economy of the U.S. is likely not going to be thrown into recession necessarily as a result of these tariffs, but the countries we get into it with, they oftentimes aren't the stable economies of the U.S. He got into a standoff with Colombia. I'm sure he's going to get in a standoff. He's now looking at the European nations, and it's thought that there might be an emerging trade war with them. I mean, again, our friends, our allies. I think he likes to bully these countries that we have a relationship with, and that we have, there's an asymmetry of the power. We're more powerful than they are, so we can kind of get away with it. It's a weird thing. But my point, just to finish it, is they can be destabilized by a trade war because their economies aren't as powerful and as robust as ours. And that's bad for us in the U.S. You don't want your allies and friends to have economies that have become destabilized. Russia and China benefit enormously from all of this. All right, now I want to get to...
Mark, can I just comment on that real quick? Because I think that is a very, very astute and important point you just made, okay? To me, the issue isn't, okay, is gas going to go up 10 cents? I would hate that. You would hate that. Everyone would hate that, okay? The larger big picture, and it's even beyond the stock market and the economy, it's strategic interests. We do not want a wedge driven between us and the EU. Certainly not when we're trying to put pressure on Putin to get things resolved with Ukraine, all right? Certainly when we're not trying to make sure that we don't push China and Russia even closer together, right, with some of our other adversaries. So to me, the biggest concern, and certainly in the Western Hemisphere, with concerns, this thing about Panama, by the way, is really about Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere. That's what it ultimately is about. And, I think we have to be careful strategically. This is really important, how we treat our Western Hemisphere partners, Canada and Mexico, and how we treat our European partners as it relates to the larger strategic interests, not just of the United States, but of the entire free world. And I think that to me, if there's an overriding concern, I think that is job one.
So let me double back now to the Musk infiltration of government. Kim kind of made the point, as I was sort of talking about this at the beginning of the show, that, where is Congress on this? I mean, AID is an established arm of U.S. government. It's existed for decades, and it's not something you can just shut down by fiat if you're Elon Musk. But that's exactly what's happened. Now, shouldn't there be congressional pushback on that? Or aren't they the cops on the beat?
Yeah, absolutely. This was established, USAID was established as a quasi-independent agency in 1961 during the Kennedy administration. And it was established by statute, as you rightly point out, Mark, by Congress. So there is some concern, but I will tell you, you're starting to hear a lot of rumblings, especially in the last week, inside the Democratic Party and inside the Democratic establishment itself. It's like, where are our guys and gals, right? Where is the pushback? I mean, the only time you've seen it really visibly in the last 2 weeks, in my view, most visibly, is in those congressional confirmation hearings, right? The senatorial hearings. But in terms of policy, in terms of legislation, now Jeffries has come out this morning and said, well, we're going to put a bunch of bills in about this and about that. Well, the challenge, of course, becomes how are you going to move those in a Republican-controlled Congress, right? But Democrats are looking for more pushback than they're getting, all right? As far as Musk goes, let's just take USAID as an example, because I think this is really key. Yes, there are a couple of things going on here. One is congressional oversight and congressional pushback. I would expect and would expect we would see a lot more of that this week, particularly from Democrats on the Hill. and from some Republicans who are just more, traditionalists. Hey, listen, there's even Republicans in the MAGA camp. Listen, you can't just do stuff that, we have oversight on without consulting with us, right? So there's that. The other piece of it is the USAID thing to me is particularly interesting because look what happened as of today. Rubio was named the interim director of USAID. He is our U.S. Secretary of State. Why is that significant? Because people have said for a long time, there's three legs to any kind of strategic interest influence. Defense, okay, and then development, and also diplomacy, all right? And this development piece is what the Chinese have tried to exploit in the last few years without getting too wonkish about it with their so-called Belt and Road strategy, all right, where they're giving a lot of money, including in the Western Hemisphere, to try to extend their influence through the use of aid. And I think my personal sense about where this is headed is pulling AID underneath State Department in an attempt to make it more strategic rather than functioning independent from a broader three-part strategic plan. Does that make sense?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that's where this is headed.
I was talking at the beginning of the show about just what you are speaking of. I was talking about the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and how this influence is a real thing and how USAID does that on some level, and it's a value. I've never really thought about trying to bring it into some sort of coherence with State Department policy. I've always thought that was implied. I mean, that essentially American influence in defense of those American values that we generally all share, those things are reflected in USAID influence around the world. I mean, I get it. Sometimes it's feeding these communities that are starving because of drought or because of politics, and sometimes it is infrastructure projects in Latin America, et cetera. So it runs the gamut, but all of it seemed to kind of fall into some kind of profile of what America would want in terms of influence. So canceling USAID or pulling it back, to me, it really hurts the soft power that America has. Our ability to bring people to understand America's role in the world as a positive one. It interrupts that quite dramatically, and it leaves it, as you've kind of suggested, and I was saying at the beginning of the show, you cede that then to China and these countries that sort of see the longer game.
Yeah, I do think, there's a real plus and minus to everything. This one pastor, a very wise pastor in Santa Barbara, who, God bless him, passed away a year ago, told me one time, you know what, Gary, your greatest strength is also your greatest weakness. And there's so much truth in that personally and nationally. And, Trump's strength, some people would say, is his ability to make the deal, right? Leverage, power. But the problem is what you're getting at, Mark. And I think the danger zone comes when people see you as nothing but that. Right? Nothing but the raw power deal making. I mean, there's a place for that. There has been in foreign policy for eons. All right. There's a place to exert power and influence, and there's a place to reach out a hand, to be compassionate, to draw one, put an arm around one's shoulder and draw one close in a genuine way. And I think that's the balance that people are looking for now that appears to be missing. And I think you're right that there is a danger if we're not careful about this, about the U.S. looking more like a bully than a friend around the world.
Yeah, someone was just asking in the comments, there it is, Chanda was saying, can the Homeland Security Office or NSA do anything like they did with Snowden? Elon is a spy, she says. He has shown how he is a Nazi. That's not enough. What can we do? Well, I mean, he is the chosen spy of the President of the United States. So I don't know that you can kind of just label him Nazi spy and then turn the NSA loose on him. I mean, my God, he was given the keys to the Treasury by the president. So I don't know that makes a lot of sense. But do comment on this troubled figure, Elon. I mean, he's not... we're trying to, in a way, fit all of these things into our understanding of the way government has proceeded and in American interests have proceeded up until this point. But you got to admit, I mean, Elon into the Treasury, getting all of that information, sensitive information from business, from personal taxpayers, information, Social Security numbers, et cetera. I mean, all of this, even his competition, Gary. I mean, there are businesses that he competes with. They have a registry of them and how much they're paying. There's a bunch of information on there. It's all being downloaded. There's a sense of a breach here that is pretty significant.
Well, I think you've hit on one of the longer term concerns with Elon's involvement. And that is, you can get into the details of contracts with SpaceX and, his, actual connections to him financially. That has always been a line that people have said, we can't cross that if you're in quote unquote government service, right? You don't also, out of the left hand, take money from the government, right? And that's the concern right now when it comes to those types of things. I just really wonder, Mark, and a lot of it we're going to see in the budget process coming up. I mean, Congress has got to deal with a budget, a significant budget matter by mid-March. I'm just wondering, this stuff's great, throw around ideas, even the drama of taking some USAID logos down and photos down in the halls of the building. But, how much influence is Elon going to have when the rubber meets the road and the House and the Senate have to pass an actual budget that funds each of these entities, right? I mean, that's really where the rubber meets the road. I just sort of wonder how long it's going to take for some of this to lose momentum. I don't say fizzle out. I just don't know if Elon's got 4 years of bureaucracy in him. You know what I'm saying? Sometimes these things can kind of be flash in the pan if you're not used to kind of hunkering down like some of these senators are with a 5-year legislative plan. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, that's the old school Washington, but as you say, these guys come in with a wrecking ball, and they're not really looking to get that wrecking ball permitted. They're just looking to get that wrecking ball started. And that's what they did over the weekend. I mean, it started actually last week with the freeze, then the unfreeze of the freeze, then the USAID office being shut down and told those people to stay home. And they, as you suggested, sort of appointed on their own someone to run it on an interim basis. And then you've got, this to me is the coup de grace, is him taking over, Elon taking over the Treasury and in the payment part, like the last part of the Treasury, which when I say take over, it includes his people logging on and connecting with all the U.S. government servers. I find it alarming. So you're right. I think he's not a slow burn guy based on what I've seen. But by the same token, he is setting fire to things in only his first week.
Yeah, well, to me, some of the tail of the tape, Mark, is what happened on that edict last week that was rescinded in 24 hours. That wasn't a good look, but I think it kind of had a lot of people whispering, yeah, see, we kind of told you so. Some of these ideas are coming out half-baked. That's never a good thing, by the way. I think there's a middle ground. Let me put it to you this way. I think there's a middle ground between dropping something at midnight that's going to take effect at 8 a.m. the next morning and, let's have a commission. Let's study it for 10 years. Let's come back with a big report. Let's issue legislation that, of course, as we know, rarely goes anywhere, right? That's what you're referring to. That's the other extreme in Washington. Lots of rhetoric, nothing happens. I think most people in Washington would be more than happy with some middle ground, right? Okay, let's make some changes, but let's take our foot off the gas so we're not locking doors at midnight.
Depressed Canadian says, Gary, they are simply stripping the U.S. for parts. Like a company on the verge of collapse, the execs loot the payroll and pensions before they flee. That's a great parallel. I'm unclear. Exactly how that takes hold, but I can take a shot at it. Essentially, Musk has articulated, and again, this is if you take him at his word, the desire to cut from the budget. He wanted to cut, what did he say, $2 trillion is what he said originally?
Right.
Which is just absurd. But they pull these numbers out of thin air. But in any case, in that effort, he wants to cut billions every day. And so he is being blocked from shutting down some agencies. We've just the freeze, right, of all U.S. aid and the freeze of all U.S. disbursements. That was, as you suggested, that was pulled back 24 hours later. So we couldn't do that. So now he's looking at these other ways, and he's actually gone to the payment system at the Treasury to sort of see where the money's going. That's putting the best face on what is, to me, an illegal and outrageous move. But That's really what he's trying to do. But, and then I'll stop, and I want to get your impression. On the table, what I'm hearing, on the table is every bit of the entitlement world that we think is untouchable. You know, the Social Security checks of the world. That would be privatized somehow. So you take it out of government. Now, it seems outrageous. It seems crazy. It's the third rail of American politics, etc. But let's face it. Musk ain't playing by the it seems by rules. You know, the it seems by the old world politics. All of these things. Comment on what his mission statement seems to be, and how this all might shake out in service of that mission plan to cut so much from the U.S. budget.
Yeah. Well, you know, he comes from his private sector world where he runs the show, right? So when he says something, SpaceX is going to do it, right? I mean, that's how it works. But, you know, we have seen some of this movie before. I think back to when Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected governor of California. People wanted change. Nobody said we'd ever recall a governor. First time in 150 years, it happened. A big splash. I mean, more media than I've ever seen anywhere. People who may not have remembered those days in California, or certainly would follow him, was going to come with this massive change agenda. And there was actually 3 or 4 propositions put on the California ballot, and tens of millions of dollars are raised, and all of those got defeated. Why? Well, because, you know, I hate to use the time-worn frame, but to some degrees, the entrenched interests, some would say very legitimate interests, said, well, not so fast, bub. And when you talk about changing things like Social Security, you're talking about tens of millions of senior citizens. When you talk about changing Medicaid or Medicare, you're talking about an exceptionally powerful American Medical Association and, you know, and insurance companies. I'm simply saying there is a certain inertia to rapid change that is just a reality that every executive branch leader faces at some point. And, you know, that is starting to happen with Trump, and I would expect happen more. So I think I just want to caution us that just because Elon puts out a press release or just puts out a tweet is more his style, that XYZ is going to happen. Let's see.
That may be comfort for those who are at a high DEFCON status. It is definitely a time when things are happening quickly, but again, the takeaway may be from what Gary's just said, that there are some inflexible parts of government that you can't just wipe away in 24 hours with, with the urge, even with the blessing of the president and with a tweet. Vilma says, not worried about the Grammys. I'm worried about the takeover of our country in plain sight. Trump is the figurehead and Elon is taking over. Call me crazy, but that's the way I see it, says Vilma. Well, it's certainly true. If history's a guide, Trump doesn't really care much about policy and stuff. He'd rather, I think, make some pronouncements. He's kind of playing president, and then he goes out and hits the golf course. That was the first 4 years. He's also done a version of that here, but he's definitely he has in place the Project 2025 people, and that's the last thing I want to ask you about. You know, the Russell vote confirmation, which has yet to even come down. He was really one of, if not the primary author of Project 2025, and he runs OMB. You and I have talked about the Office of Management and Budget before, how critical it is in terms of disbursement. So when you're talking about controlling monies, that is a place where Russell Vought will have a lot of power if he wants it, and he was the guy behind freezing all of the expenditures in one of the first official acts of the new administration, right, Gary?
Well, here's the thing about Project 2025 that I'm finding interesting politically, Mark. You're hearing the occasional senator bring it up, but not much. I mean, I think that's very telling because remember, a lot of the campaign against Trump was built on that premise. Remember, we talked about it a lot, especially last fall, last summer. And, you know, the Democrats made it kind of one of their 3 major planks of the campaign, right? One was he was crazy and he was a Nazi and he was this, that. Other, he's going to strip your rights away like abortion. All. And the third one is, you know, there's this nefarious Project 2025 that every school kid's going to be made to memorize as of, you know, November 6th. And you know, what's interesting to me, Mark, is, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't hear that much about it from Democrats. they sort of, I think some of them feel like, you know what, that didn't get us very far. We're not making that, putting that on the marquee again. Because, you know, again, apart from an occasional reference, that's not center stage anymore.
Well, I would say to you, politically, it's not center stage as a reference, but from a governmental administrative standpoint, it is the only stage. It is literally that which is going into the implementation of the last week's policies. As I say, the freeze, Musk very much a part of that pullback, but more to the point, this guy Vogt, who will get confirmation this week for the Office of Management and Budget, he's the one who really wants, he's like the Musk of government, like with the, the more buttoned down Musk. Musk, as you said, is sort of the tech bro, come in, he runs his own thing, he's a gunslinger. Vogt, not so much. He's a quieter version with an extremely well-articulated plan. So this is to be continued, but I'd suggest to you that Project 2025, you're right, not being spoken of by Democrats, but being implemented by the new administration. So, but as I say, to be continued. I know I love our back and forth on this stuff. You can find Gary across the CBS television stations and also on iHeartRadio, and you find him here. We look forward to it. It's the one part of the weekend rounding up that I really look forward to is our Monday conversations. Thank you, Gary.
Thanks a lot, Mark.
Gary Dietrich, everybody. And Gary is sponsored by Bill Campbell at RE/MAX Gold. If you're relocating into or from Northern California, Bill Campbell is your guy. Highly respected real estate professional. You can reach him a couple of different ways. You can text him, 530-448-7474, or you can call him at that same number, 530-448-7474. Bill Campbell, RE/MAX Gold. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.